is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the first Sunday in Lent for the week of February 22nd, 2026. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to get in this week's podcast, and I am excited when we move into the season of Lent, this season of reflection, this season that I think begs for us to slow down, and especially within the culture that we're in, it's very difficult for us to do that. It feels very countercultural for us to be able to slow down enough to be able to fully absorb what we are trying to contemplate, consider, reflect on. And especially here we get into the text that we have for this week, looking at our lives and thinking about our lives and how we have impact beyond what we can understand directly right in front of us, I think is a very important aspect of the Lenten season. And especially in a world that I feel in a lot of ways wants to move faster and faster and faster, at times that can be very difficult for us to get to that place where we actually allow ourselves to contemplate and be considerate of how we are affecting others. And it gets into the question that we had for last week, which was, how are you preparing to sit and listen in Lent instead of relying solely on what your eyes can see? And I got some good responses back this week, but one of the things being talked about was the idea of how we at times don't allow ourselves to fully utilize our senses. We have so much going on that we become desensitized to the abilities of what our senses are. For instance, taking our eyes, that our eyes see well at night if we don't give light to them. It allows our eyes to dilate wider, to let more light in, and that we are able to see decently well, not maybe amazing, but we can definitely see okay at night if we allow ourselves and give the opportunity to be able to do that. Same with our own hearing. And it's something that, as I've done like birding surveys, it's that slowing down of the body to be able to actually finally tune in and not push away background noise, but amplify that to be able to hear different things and be able to really truly understand and absorb what is going on around us instead of pushing it aside. One of the examples we got from one of our loyal listeners this last week was talking about how a friend of his was going hunting out in the UP of Michigan, 10 miles away from the nearest road. And for the first 2 days, they didn't hear anything. But by day 3, that they were starting to actually hear the trucks that were 10 miles away, and allowing ourselves to actually let go to be able to actually hear. And I think in a lot of ways, when we are looking at the Lenten season, when we're looking at this contemplation time, we have to let go of things to be able to absorb what is coming in as well, and allowing us to really truly be filled and move forward into that next phase. So let's just get into it this week. The Old Testament text is out of Genesis chapter 2, verses 15 through 17, and chapter 3, verses 1 to 7. And this text is kind of going through what would be conceived as the first sin in the Old Testament, the first sin in the Bible, where God has created the Garden of Eden. At this point, just Adam has been created, and tells him to be able to eat anything of the garden except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil. If you eat that, you shall surely die. Then we skip ahead, and the verses that are cut out is the creation of Eve. And I think there is a key important thing that is stated in verse 25 that is worth inserting, is that they are together, they are naked, and they're unashamed, as it is stated. But then we get starting in chapter 3, verse 1, where now the serpent is convincing, in this case, the woman, to be able to eat of this. Are you really going to die? Type of concept. Their eyes are opened as we get in verse 5. And in doing that, they are ashamed that they are naked and make loincloths for themselves. So we see this change, this different consciousness that comes about, this different recognition, and suddenly there is things that have separated us from God, and we notice that then by verse 7. The psalm this week then is Psalm 32, all 11 verses of it, and this is the recognition on how our sins, when forgiven and recognizing the forgiveness that God gives to us, gives us a different joy, gives us a different spirit about us. but it's not necessarily to then abuse that. It's through that acknowledgement of that sin, being able to know when we have fallen short and acknowledge it and talk about that it truly frees us to be able to recognize and be able to move in a direction that actually brings us closer, and thus being able to turn from that and move in a direction consistently that brings us closer to see the love that God has for us. But I would also argue the love that God has placed around us that is so easy for us to ignore if we are holding in that sin, if we aren't open about talking about it. It allows for the love of God to actually be shown and for our eyes to be able to see it. The epistle text this week, or second reading, is from Romans chapter 5, verses 12 to 19. This then is recognizing that it's not necessarily by our own deeds or our own humanness that we are being able to be forgiven of sin. In fact, when we look through the history of life, we have continued along this chain of sin, continue to be woven within the human existence. And that's where Jesus comes in and sets it and changes everything. This recognition on how this one person then was able to release us from the judgment of sin, and that this is something then that we should recognize and acknowledge. And it's not that Jesus did this to condemn us for our sins, but actually as a right of righteousness, a justification, this way to be able to bring us closer and acknowledge that, yes, you fall short, but yet the grace of God is greater than what you have done, as long as we are able to communicate and talk about this, and being able to bring relationships together in that way, instead of looking at it as a shaming of things, and being able to have something that grows from it in the long term because of what we have learned from that. The gospel text then this week is out of Matthew chapter 4, the first 11 verses of it. And this is Matthew's version of the temptation, where Jesus is led by the Spirit into the wilderness and is tested by the devil for 40 days and 40 nights while fasting. And we then have 3 different times where the tempter, as it is stated, is tempting Jesus to command the stones becomes loaves of bread. And Jesus then responds with, "One does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." So then the devil takes him to the pinnacle of the temple and says, "Throw yourself down," and starts quoting scripture. "He will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." Jesus responds with, "Again it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." And finally, the devil brings him up a high mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he says, "All of this I can give to you if you fall down and worship me." Jesus responds with, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." And the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on Jesus. We get this interesting recognition as well, as we recognize that God is in control of everything. We have Satan being able to at least promise the world. And that's when Jesus steps in and says, "No, get away. You don't have dominion here. You do not have control of that. Let go of that, and let me show the true power of what God is able to do." So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plug. But Working Preacher, if you've interested in Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, directions, also having the history of different commentaries that are there to think about how are other biblical scholars looking at and considering and thinking about these texts. And it gives you a different way of looking at and considering and processing these texts as you are preparing for either sitting in the pews or being in front of the pews, or just in your own study of scripture. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend that. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but also having the art, prayers, hymns, the different daily readings to get you into these texts. It's an amazing resource to be able to really think about and utilize the text and be able to go a little bit deeper in different ways than you can in like Working Preacher. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Vinny Library, I'd highly recommend that also. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Greenblade's Preaching Roundtable and the Greenblade's Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies through the weekly lectionary, along with a lot of other ecological ways of looking at these texts. If you enjoy when we get into more of an ecologically heavy type of topic, as we will this week, I know you're going to enjoy these texts, and heck, if you enjoy listening to this podcast for a half an hour each week, I think you're going to enjoy a lot of the different resources that are over there. So check out the Greenblade's Preaching Roundtable and the Greenblade's Rising publications. That'll be the first link down in the show notes under the references section. When we think about and consider the first sin, when we talk about the temptation of Jesus, there's a lot of things here to look at. There's been a lot of accusations that have been made on different sides, and I'm not going to get into that aspect of things. I think one of the things that we are truly looking at this week is thinking about and looking at how do we as people think about these things? What is our natural tendencies? What is our way of handling and interpreting these things naturally versus where Jesus is trying to take us? And I think when we start looking at that and considering that, and then looking at, especially coming out of the Garden of Eden, looking at how did God design this place? What is our tendencies? And how do those not always mix? And so what can we learn from this? So this week, we're going to talk about Robert T. Paine, not Robert Paine of the American Revolution, but Robert T. Paine, because he did some amazing breaking research in the mid-1960s into the 1970s, and it changed our way that we look at ecology. And I think when we start taking that principle and applying it to what we are seeing within these texts, I think we can start seeing some themes and some things that maybe are some warning signs that we need to be thinking about and contemplating as a society about what our tendencies are with certain things. So let's just jump into it. We in the past have talked about trophic cascades. We have talked about keystone species before, but we have to go back to a time before that happened, and we'll get into defining what that really means. But in the 1960s, in particular, Robert T. Paine was in western Washington state, was on the coast, and recognizing these barnacles and the different ecosystems that were there, and started noticing these predatory sea stars and how they had definite preferences on what they preferred to eat, and was wondering is when they are eating these different barnacles and things and mussels of things that they prefer eating, how is that affecting the ecosystem? And so he decided to make a couple test plots where one set of test plots, he wasn't going to do anything, but he was going to do another set of test plots where he was going to remove these sea stars from that section and see what happens and monitor it consistently. What he noticed over about a 5-year period is that the number of species where the sea stars were, that he didn't do anything, the diversity or number of species was around 15. Where he removed the predatory sea stars, the number of species in those areas dropped from 15 to 8. So it was cut in half. And what he noticed was you would have certain ones that were super successful initially, but then they would get kind of taken over drastically, and without having any type of predatory effect, anything to take them out, they just continued to dominate and control, and so you got less biodiversity within an ecosystem. Now, as we've talked about before, biodiversity, the number of species within an area, the less biodiversity there is, the more fragile that ecosystem is. It isn't as sustainable. It isn't as resilient two changes because you have created a bottleneck. You created something that has limited the ability of that ecosystem to be able to take on changes in that ecosystem. So thus you have made it so that it isn't as resilient. Well, you would initially think, well, just give it time. It'll fix itself. Well, he did do that research. And what he concluded was it wasn't that simple. It took an extremely long period of time. And in fact, when he was coming back 10 to 15 years later, the ecosystem of those spots still had not yet recovered and was staying at the same levels, 8 species, as it had right after, within a couple years. So this aspect of what then we were able to find is, again, a keystone species, a species that has bigger impact than what we would initially think on an ecosystem. Additionally, what we were able to see is that with removing that predatory keystone species in this case, it then had the additional impact even on secondary creatures or species that didn't have a direct impact with the sea star, aka that they did some additional testing and found that the food chain had been dramatically altered to a species that wasn't a predator or prey of the sea star being affected by the removal of those sea stars. And this brings us into a whole conversation, as we've talked about before, of keystone species. We've talked about prairie dogs before, but look at like fig trees within ecosystems. Fig trees with having fruit year round, it allows for sustenance for monkeys, birds, bats, elephants, other countless animals, because they're continuing to fruit in seasons when other fruit trees don't fruit. And thus it gives something of sustenance to these animals, these species that are looking for something to eat. You remove those fig trees, now you're having a cascade of the lack of food causing for potential collapse of the ecosystem and the biodiversity that's there. This is where we also get like elephants being these eco-engineers and being able to change ecosystems by knocking down trees or moving through grasslands and things of that nature. We've talked about beavers creating different wetlands and changing the ecosystems around them. Wildebeest would be another one with their long migration and them eating along the way, causing different heights of the savanna grasses that are there, along with droppings and being able to fertilize the soil across the way, and thus being able to create something that is much more sustainable. And the list goes on and on of these keystone species and the impact of what they will have on an ecosystem. So how does this then all tie back to specifically like the temptation of Jesus in Matthew 4? Specifically, when we have these promises, especially the last promise by Satan of you just fall down and you can get all of this. Satan is pulling stuff out of his butt. He's promising things he has no control over, but yet thinks that he does. And the aspect of this is the idea of what if Jesus had? What if Jesus was tempted? We have these promises that are empty promises. And even if Satan was able to start to do that, what is the impact that that has on everything around this? The ego of one now outnumbers the benefit to everyone. This is part of the amazing sacrifice of what Jesus will get to here in 40 days. The aspect of how Jesus was not willing to elevate Jesus' self to this level that Jesus deserved, but Jesus did not for the betterment of everyone around Jesus and for future generations and for those who have come before, to be able to bring a connection point to God directly. This means that we can't be to a point where we are putting ourselves on a pedestal above everybody else, because that's not what Jesus did. And this relates so wonderfully with ecosystems, where so often as humans, we say we are in control of this place. We have ultimate control. We can move the land. We can do all these things. The earth is going to be okay. But yet, when we start looking at like what Robert T. Payne did within his research, that may or may not be the case. Because we may or may not understand fully how this ecosystem is working and what the effects are of what we are doing. Do we understand the relationships that are all being connected together in the ecosystem? Do we recognize the impact of, if we do this, how this is going to affect all these different species that are interacting within that ecosystem, that they are dependent on each other? Do we understand that complexity? We obviously did not understand the complexity in the Garden of Eden with the tree of good and evil. We thought we knew better, even though God said, do not do this. We thought we knew better. We find that no, that is not the case. We get kicked out of Eden. We have this acknowledgement within ourselves where often we feel that we are so elevated. And that's part of what Paul is getting at, is this recognition of sin has been within us our whole lives. But we have to acknowledge what Jesus did for us was completely out of grace, completely out of sacrifice, completely for redemption of others, not redemption of Jesus. And how often we do things for the redemption of ourselves. How often we do things to elevate our own selves instead of acknowledging that it's God who is doing that. We elevate ourselves, we look to ourselves, we think about all these things that I am doing instead of how is this affecting things beyond me first. The removal of those sea stars collapsed those ecosystems by 50%. It dramatically changed things for decades afterwards, that the ecosystem had a hard time being able to recover because of the effects of what we had done. Within our own faith, within our own lives, within the world in which we live, we have to be very careful of these same things. I think within families we can recognize this, or within communities, that there are people who hold a lot of weight, who have dramatic amounts of impact to a community, to a family. And then when they lose them, how hard that can be for a community or a family. And that in certain ways, they are never the same. And it's not that we're going to fully get rid of that, but I think it's also acknowledging that isn't just something with humans, it's something that's also within creation in and of itself. And so then we have to acknowledge and treasure the times that we have with people, but we also have to acknowledge the impact of how we benefit from the creation, and the creation benefits from us if we are able to work in tandem together. So often we look at consuming creation instead of giving back to creation, and acknowledging that give and take, acknowledging where are places that we just need to let be nature. And maybe we observe and watch and learn instead of consistently placing ourselves in it. I did a cross-country ski actually yesterday with some family, and one of the things that there was an area in which we were trying to ski, and there was these signs up talking about there was a species of concern or species they were concerned about, that they were blocking off the ski trails and walking trails from February 1st through the end of July. And the picture had like a bald eagle on it. And what you could tell is, okay, knowing my biology, that's the beginning of breeding season for the bald eagle in the area that I'm at. And that would get you through first section of specifically the young being able to at least hatch and starting to be fledglings and starting to work on doing some flights, that they're trying to protect their nests from human interaction. Let nature. Instead of us interacting and us getting close, or people in the know, and we sometimes just have to respect an area and just let it be. I think there's a lot of times that it's really easy for us to elevate and say, well, if I do this, what's the harm? It's one person. But the problem is it isn't often one person then. It opens the door for many. And I think in the world in which we're in a lot of places, it's the aspect that we have gotten to where there is people who have elevated themselves ahead of others, ahead of communities, ahead of creation itself, for their own benefit, for a select group of people's benefit, and assume that then everyone is on board with that. And we don't often think about and contemplate what are the effects that has for everyone. And these are not fun, easy questions to wrestle with. Especially me, this is easy for me to be saying as being in a first world country, being in a place that I have a small chunk of land, I have a home, I have the consumption of fossil fuels consistently that is not hard to come by. And that there's times that we have to be able to consider and think about what is the impact not only on me, not only on other humans, but also on the environment and the creation in which we are told to take care of, where we are instructed to acknowledge and take care of the place in which we are at. I would argue for our world, Lent is necessary. It is necessary for us to slow down enough to acknowledge and take time to see where we all fall short. Not something just to beat ourselves up about, but to humble ourselves. Allowing ourselves to actually see the realities of what is going on around us and to be able to maybe better work in harmony, not with just other people, but also creation in and of itself. And allowing ourselves to potentially learn from creation instead of saying we know more than creation. Lent is a time of reflection. Lent is a time of inward time, but also a time that we then should be sharing those learnings with others. It's an important time for us to be humbled, to make sure that we are not overstretching and thinking we understand something and, oh, this is a nuisance, so I'm just going to get rid of it, and not understanding what that is going to do for the long-term ramifications. There's a lot that nature can teach us. I know one of the things that my mother growing up on a farm would always tell us that her dad taught her is you can always tell how long a rainstorm is going to be. If it's a passing storm, the birds will go and hide away and it's quiet because it's this quick passing storm. But if the birds are willing to get wet, they know it's going to be a rainy day for an extended period of time, so you might as well get wet. There's simple little things where we can learn and acknowledge if we allow ourselves to open our own eyes and listen and contemplate and consider. So the question I have for you this week is, where have you been humbled recently? Where have you been humbled recently? Because I think, especially as we are in this Lenten season, I think it should be something of consideration for us. It should be something that is normal for us to be humbled, to allow us to work on things, to allow us to reflect and make sure that we don't get haughty on ourselves and get ahead of our own selves. So as we enter the season of reflection, as we enter the season of thinking about things, I really hope and pray that you take this section of time and reflect and slow down. Even as the world tries to keep going faster and faster, look at that at times as temptation and take this period of time to really reflect so that when we come out of this season of reflection, we are able to move with conviction and with certainty as we take those steps boldly moving forward. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.